Good morning. Welcome to the Basstravaganza. Kind of a grim episode this time. It's April 2020, right in the middle of the great plague that is sweeping planet Earth. People getting sick, people dying all over the place, all over the world, all over Canada, Vancouver Island. And normally this time of year I would be out throwing this rubber worm for spring smallmouth. I'm going to throw it out anyway, but I know I'm not going to catch nothing because as you can see, the mighty bullshit is not in the water. It's grounded here while the plague progresses. And so I didn't catch nothing. Look at that. No bites on the rubber worm, and otherwise I might be throwing these homemade topwater plugs out made out of super cypress cedar. Not right now. Everything's in lockdown and the world might be coming to an end. Who knows? I might not be here a week from now, and you start to think about loose ends, tying up loose ends, and in particular, in my case, I started this Basstravaganza years ago. If you remember, I proposed that we would get a bunch of bass fishermen together and we'd carve a mountain somewhere. Find a mountain that nobody's using and carve the top of it into the heads of four great heroes of bass fishing. And not only heroes of bass fishing, heroes of top water bass fishing. And in previous episodes, I've already proposed 3 of the 4 great heroes. And so it's time to propose the 4th. So if you remember, do a little retrospective here. When I started out, my first lure that I proposed was Zara Spook, and I went on to fabricate some of my own imitations. Caught lots of bass on those on previous expeditions, and got lots more on file that I've never published. And the second great hero was Fred Arbogast, who invented this jitterbug plug. And then I went on to make my own imitations out of super cypress cedar, by the way, and caught some fish on those. And our third hero was, it was actually going to start out to be Laurie Rapala until the last moment. I found out that he didn't actually invent that lure that is commonly called the Rapala. It was actually invented by a guy named Toivo Pilvalainen. So my imitations are not Rapalas, they're called Toivos. So made Toivo out of super cypress cedar, and then kind of got sidetracked onto spinning lures, and the MEP spinner, store-bought one up on top there, and some of my homemade imitations. But that leaves still the one great blank up on Mount Fishmore for the head of the 4th great hero of topwater bass fishing. And I'm going to try to address that in this episode. So the 4th great topwater lure that we are going to honor here on the Basstravaganza is this buzzbait. And similar to my episode, if you remember, I did an episode about these plugs commonly called Rapalas that are, as I found out at the last minute, I already built my snow mountain and I was going to look for images of Lowry Rapala, and found out that it wasn't really him that invented the lure. It was this Toivo guy. So a similar thing here. I've been looking for a number of years. That's one reason that I postponed making this episode. I could never find a name for the guy that invented this buzzbait lure. And 2 days ago, had no idea, but I put some more time into Googling and sleuthing on the internet, and I actually found out the name of the guy that is claimed to be the inventor of the buzzbait. And not only that, he apparently may be still alive. And I was able to search the internet the way you do these days, and I found telephone numbers for him. And my fantasy, I was setting this up yesterday morning, my fantasy was that I was going to do this intro and then phone him up and talk to him live. It would be like talking to God live on video. That didn't work out. When I phoned those numbers, they were derelict and no longer in service. And did some more sleuthing later in the day. I was not able to locate him, but I've got some interesting information. Anyway, the guy's name is Don Gentry. Like me, he's from Illinois, from the state of Illinois in the U.S. And apparently he started making these buzzbait lures back in the 1970s. And what I did learn is that he was at least 90, because they listed his age at 90 whenever that derelict website was posted. I was not able to reach him by phone, so I'm going to go back and track a little bit about the history of the development of this lure. And one thing you notice about the buzzbait, as opposed, these are not topwater lures, I'm going to take them away, but these four great types of topwater lures, there's a big difference between this buzzbait and any of the others. Namely that these lures, well, this is plastic now because the original lure design has been bought up by some faceless multinational corporation, and they whack these out of plastic in some other part of the world. But the original, and same thing with the jitterbugs now too, but the original lures were all made out of wood. My lures are made out of wood. The difference between those lures and this one is that this one's made out of metal. So here are the jitterbug, the Toivo, the spook, and the buzzbait. Can you notice a difference? So how is it possible to make a topwater lure out of metal? How is it possible to make metal walk on water? That's where we meet up with our fourth great hero of bass fishing, Don Gentry, from down in southern Illinois. And before we get into the details of the buzzbait, I want to backtrack a little bit. Go back to the episode where I discussed the evolution of the MEP spinner and the concept of a spinning blade on a metal shaft. And that MEP spinner was adapted by bass fishermen. They put a spinner onto a little grub and a lead head jig kind of thing, and made, people call this a spinner bait. I don't know why, but these are old rusty. They're such good lures. They catch fish so well. I never use them. It's too easy to catch bass on these. But anyway, this is a single blade spinner bait there. This one's got 2 blades. This one's got 3 blades on it, or no, that one's got 2. Anyway, the idea is you pull this through the water. It's got a big hook and a lead chunk on the bottom that pulls it down, and these flashy blades spin around on the top and attract the fish. So that was kind of a takeoff on the MEP spinner idea. Another way they put spinner blades on was on the front and the back of floating bass lures, wooden bass lures. They put these little spinner blades on them. But it wasn't until this Don Gentry came along. I mean, you remember Isaac Newton, right? He was supposed to be really smart. He figured out the law of gravity and all that stuff, but did he ever make a metal lure walk on water? I don't think so. They say that Albert Einstein was so smart because he invented the theory of relativity and all that stuff, but did he ever make metal walk on water? And let me ask you this, how many big bass did either one of them guys catch? Not very many, I'll tell you that. So what is it about John Gentry that makes him be able to see beyond our normal human perception? So you have to look at the design of this buzzbait to understand. So this body here is made out of lead. The hook's made out of steel, the shaft's made out of steel, the blade, this one has two blades. It's a funky one. It's not a very good one in my opinion. It's the only one I have right now handy. But it is, most of these have just one blade. This one has two, but you can see the whole thing is made out of metal except for this little bit of rubber. Everything sinks. But the idea is it has this propeller on top. And if you throw it out and if you start reeling in quickly before the lure sinks underwater, this propeller starts spinning along the surface. And it will actually pull the lure and hold it right on the surface. And not only that, it'll make noise. The commotion and that clanking, whining noise, and the disturbance that this lure makes on the surface attracts really aggressive predators. And that's the secret of Don Gentry. And that's why Don Gentry's head is going up onto Mount Fishmore. So the idea behind this great lure is actually pretty simple. Take a hook and you basically extend the hook, extend the wire, and then you bend the wire back over the top. The top end of the wire, you put a little propeller blade and you attach your line to the bend in the middle. Then you can you put some lead along the hook on the bottom to make sure that side goes down, and maybe a little bit of wiggly, grubby stuff. A rubber worm works good on there, anything to hide the hook. So you throw this metal lure out, and just as it hits the water, you start pulling it back in. And as this blade spins around, it's hitting the surface of the water. Every time it splats on the water, it keeps pulling the lure up and holding it on the surface. So this one called the Lunker lure by Don Gentry, I believe, was the original version of this, and it's still a classic in my opinion. It had a single blade, and you can actually see the patent number stamped into the blade on this old advertisement, I think. And nonetheless, in spite of his patents and his efforts, that he did market these lures and sold a lot of them, but there were hundreds of imitations that came out. But the idea is still the same. And you throw that lure out, and the instant it hits the water, even though it's made out of steel and lead, when this blade, if you pull it right away, this blade will start churning and hitting the surface. And every time it flops on the surface, it keeps holding that lure up on that surface film of water. And that's the key to the buzzbait. So I'm going to try to basically do the same thing. I've got take one of these hooks and put it into, attach it onto a piece of wire, bend it around for blades. I'm going to try a piece of this cookie tin, or I'm going to cut out a piece of that pie plate, and we shall see what we shall see. But before we go into that, I want to go into a little bit of detail. I'm just like my episode about the Rapala lure, and ended up finding out about this Toivo Pilvalainen guy who actually invented the lure. I've been putting this off, this episode, because I could never find out the guy who invented this lure until a couple days ago. And so it was invented by a guy named Don Gentry in southern Illinois. And here's what I've been able to gather. He patented his lure, started a lure company, sold lots of lures, became famous in the small world of topwater bass fishing. Sold, and you can hear me in previous episodes of the Basstravaganza all the time whining about how these great lures that were pioneered here in North America or Europe or wherever, they get bought up by these faceless multinational corporations, and the quality of the lure goes down and the innovation ends. And so anyway, Don Ginter appears that he sold his lure company to a faceless multinational corporation, and in around, I think it was 2003 maybe, I found another link on the internet. I did some Googling, and he was disturbed at the decline in quality of his lures, and he bought his own company back, and he bought his own patents back and started rebuilding them again I think in Illinois to start with. And then some years later, it appears he had a factory going in DuQuoin, Iowa, where they made these things, and it was a really promotional, not him promoting himself, the people that wrote the newspaper story were promoting him because he was hiring disabled workers, and it sounded like a really good deal. And then I was able to Google, and I found his address and phone numbers, but when I phoned the phone numbers, they're no longer in service. What I did find was that now if you Google lunkerlure.com, it's a dead link. That company in Iowa doesn't appear to be working anymore, and what appears to have happened is that the Lunker Lure patents and brand have been bought up by some faceless multinational corporation. You can still buy these lures from Walmart or Bass Pro Shops or wherever, but it appears that once again they're just part of the global trend towards mass producing these lures in lower quality with cheaper labor in foreign countries from the place they were invented. So I'm going to keep looking for, going to keep trying to track down. I'd love to locate Don Gentry and talk to him about buzzbaits, but in the meantime, I'm going to try to make one of my own. So let's see. What we shall see. So, trying to recreate the genius of the great visionary Don Gentry, the man who taught the world how to make metal, how to make steel walk on water. Even Einstein couldn't figure that one out. So I'm going to take this steel tin from a box of cookies, a tin full of cookies, and cut a nice flat piece out of it here. I never paid that much attention in the past. Now, because I'm building one, I've got to pay attention. And what I notice is that there is different ways of skinning this cat. There are two main ways that people have built these buzzbait blades over the years. And the one that I think of as normal now is not the same way that Don Gentry built his first buzzbaits. This is that steel here, right? This is aluminum. So what I'm going to do, what's always good to do if you can when you're making lures, instead of hoping to get it right first time, build a prototype test model. I'm going to make a couple of these prototypes out of cardboard. The buzzbait, the original buzzbait, made by Don Gentry. It's got a very different way of attaching the flat metal onto the shaft. I'll show you when I make my prototypes. So let's make some prototypes out of cardboard here. Don Gentry's way of doing it was so he would bend these two corners over, and then he'd put his shaft through this way. So that's going to be my first test. So then he drilled a hole through each of those little tabs, and Bob's your uncle, right? That's spinning. And then he rolled these edges over. This is what makes Don Gentry a genius, and what makes Alfred or Albert Einstein go home with his tail between his legs because he didn't catch any bass. So there you go. There we have made the prototype Don Gentry buzzbait. I wonder if it works. Looks pretty good to me. I'd bite on that. So this is the genius idea that is going to earn Don Gentry the glory of having his likeness carved into the lofty heights of Mount Fishmore someday soon, if the Basstravaganza has anything to say about it. But in the meantime, as I mentioned, many other buzzbaits have come along and they've modified this plan quite a bit. I've used these lunker lures and I like them. They work really good, the ones made by Don Gentry. But my favorite buzzbait is called the Cabatron. Unlike the lunker lure, this is the lunker lure developed by Don Gentry, where both of these tabs are flipped up on the same side. On the Cabatron, the front one and the backward, one of them is down and one of them is up. So I'm going to try to mimic that. So you see the way Cabatron has approached this, and most, I think, modern buzzbait blade designers. The little tabs on the original lunker lure both go up in the same direction. So in many of the newer models, one tab is up, one tab is down, and the shaft goes right through the middle of the lure. And the middle of the lure is actually shaped in here to fit around that shaft. This one here has got two blades, and in particular you can see how complicated the pattern is. The blade goes in and out and through. Then these edges are curled. So you can see the difference between the two. This one is going to have much more area pressing against the metal, which might not be a bad thing, because a lot of the effectiveness of this lure comes from the noise, the squeak that this spinning blade makes on the shaft. These wear out really quickly and the blades fall off, but before they wear out, they chirp more or less according to how worn out they are. I've heard stories of professional bass fishermen that would take their brand new buzzbaits on the way to a tournament and tie them up along their radio aerial outside the car, and let them twirl in the wind as they drive down there until they start wearing out to the point where they get really noisy. And when they reach the right chirping sound, they take them off the aerial and go fish with them in the tournament. And we're not at that stage, though. We're just trying to make one lure that catches one fish. So here's the finished product. This is the classic lunker lure designed by Don Gentry, with both tabs on one side. This is what you might call the more modern. You can see it's much more sturdy. You can see the kind of complex machining you need to do. You need a metal press to really do that, to get that kind of curve bent. So this is the way. This is probably a much more durable lure, but it's harder to make, and it won't spin right now because there's so much friction on that shaft going through the hole in the middle, whereas this one, much more simple design. My first ever buzzbait. So here's my first buzzbait right there. You can see that I got so excited I made two more. This one is made out of this aluminum pie plate like the other one, with a great big blade, and this one's made out of steel, I guess that cookie tin. So here I am. It is middle of April 2020. The huge plague is ravaging the planet. I haven't been out at all lately. I've been huddled at home. Haven't been to Quesnel Lake this year yet, my first time. The reason I'm here, I'm trying to replicate the genius of our Basstravaganza hero, Don Gentry. And this is the buzzbait that he designed. And you can see it's made out of steel and aluminum and heavy plastic. Sinks like a stone if you throw it in the water. But Don Gentry had the genius vision to make steel walk on water. I'm going to see if this works. Look at that. Look at that. Look at that. So the first two that I tried out of aluminum didn't work, but this one out of steel seems to work. Good enough for me. Good enough for this cowboy. I'm going to try that. Don Ginter. So that was spring, and now it's down to the last donut of 2020. Good riddance to an awful year. I'm sure a lot of people will agree. I pretty much completed this episode last spring, just as the COVID virus was beginning to spread around the world. I didn't feel comfortable releasing it until now. Over the course of the summer and fall, I tried to learn more about Don Gentry. For all I know, he still may be alive. I found what appeared to be the obituary of his wife somewhere on the internet from a few years back. If he's still alive, I haven't been able to contact him. If he's still with us on this mortal sphere, it would be great. It would be a great honor to talk to him. Maybe even get down to southern Illinois sometime and catch some bass on a buzzbait. Anyone who can invent a maniac lure like this one that actually works is a mad genius, Don. Lucky for all the rest of us that you turned your passion towards bass lures instead of nuclear bombs or stock market manipulation or bioweapons. The world is a better place now that we have buzzbaits in our tackle boxes. I've always been dyslexic about people's names. If I get a person's name wrong once, I can't seem to correct it ever again. Over the summer virus shutdown, I was fooling around with making a homemade fly rod out of wood. Really fine yellow cedar, actually. A hexagonal rod like the ones they make out of split bamboo. Earlier in spring, I'd been getting tips from a master hex rod builder here in town. His name was Don Ginter. So his name was still on my brain when I recorded the narration for this episode last April. And as I went back to do the editing, I noticed that I mentioned Don Gentry 26 times. And I only got it right once. Every other time I called him Don Ginter. So I apologize to both Dons, and I've tried to correct this error in editing as well as I could. You'll also notice that in all my other lure making episodes, I went out and actually caught fish on my homemade imitations. Not so in this episode. And it's not because of the virus shutdown. I went out to test my homemade buzzbaits last spring, but I didn't get any bites. And not just on buzzbaits either. The trophy bass fishery that existed here on Van Isle for over a century appears to be history all of a sudden. And the big bass have disappeared over the past couple, 3 years. I attribute this partly to the fact that there are more and more people out fishing for bass every year in spite of government emphasis to downsize this fishery. But I think the big reason is a change in BC fishing regulations. For all of the 50 years that I've been here, and for a long time before that, BC had catch and release regulations on bass from April 15th until June 15th, while the big fish come into shore very shallow to spawn. The bass were treated as a valuable part of the recreational fishery. Now the province is encouraging people to kill all the big bass they catch. I expect that the motivation for this was an attempt by the bureaucracy to make it seem like they were doing something to help wild fish. I doubt that this is the real world result. After over a century here on Van Isle, smallmouth bass were never a major factor in wild salmon declines, even though the threat of people transporting them to new watersheds where they would become a threat was very real. And they're not a major factor in declining salmon stocks now. Meanwhile, the issues that are big factors in the decline of wild salmon and steelhead were not addressed in the past, and as I've tried to explain in my Tale of Two Rivers series, among other episodes, they're not being addressed now. Instead, the big reasons for the extinction of wild fish, huge corporate clear cuts and fish farms, are exempt from serious science and almost eliminated from media coverage and discussion. Over a few short years, this policy seems to have been effective, at least in terms of eliminating the trophy bass fishery. A few years ago, it would have been almost a guarantee that I could go out and catch a nice fat bass on a buzzbait here, but those days are suddenly over. So the big bass around Nanaimo and probably all of Van Isle and maybe all of southern BC have been caught out over the past few years and killed, and the recreational bass fishery is toast. It appears to be the end of my bass fishing career, at least until I may be able to make another trip to the US or Ontario, which is getting less and less likely. But I still have lots of great topwater bass video in the can, and including some cool homemade lures and some big fish, including, among other things, what I believe is the first ever recorded video of catching a barn owl on a homemade topwater lure at night. So you can look forward to that. I'd like to examine this policy change in more detail. In my opinion, the real winners in this are not the wild trout and salmon. They always seem to come out on the short end around here, and certainly not the recreational fishery. Around here, the only fish that have support and subsidy at the federal and provincial level are the ones that are thriving, and those are the frankenfish. Our oceans are now dedicated to growing exotic Atlantic salmon for the profit of huge foreign-owned multinational corporations. And our lakes, which supported legendary populations of lunker, wild trout, and bass for a century, are little more than receptacles now for truckloads of GMO clones, with gene stock coming from anywhere else besides Van Isle, mass-produced in giant factories. I hope to produce a future episode about this sometime, but not now. Let's forget about the recent past and be glad that this awful year is finally over and get on with the future. We have a new world to build out of the ruin and sickness of the old one. And now that we have our 4 great heroes selected, we need to start thinking about climbing up to the very summit of Mount Fishmore and carving their heads into those towering crags. But I guess first we'll have to select a mountain, and I don't want to climb up there in winter. There's too much snow. So let's think it over for a while before we start climbing, and sit back and have a beer and wait for the next episode of the Basstravaganza.